Hey everybody, KC here. So today, as promised, in lieu of a traditional morning news beat, we actually have a panel discussion that I had a chance to facilitate at the terrific Western Michigan University Food Marketing Conference. This took place a couple of weeks ago. It was terrific. And basically, I have four panelists. We have Don Fitzgerald, the former CEO of Dom's Kitchen and Market. Don Sanderson, the Chief Marketing Officer at Meijer. We have Herb Smith, VP of Off-Premise Customer Development and Category Management at Gallo, and Dan Wandel, Senior Director of Category Insights at Mark Anthony Group. And basically, we talked about how consumer trends, two of them specifically, are affecting how retailers and manufacturers are developing strategies and tactics to meet the moment. I thought it was a really interesting panel discussion. I hope you'll enjoy it. Here's my panel discussion at Western Michigan University's Food Marketing Conference. Enjoy, and I'll see you next Monday.
You got the hot seat.
Yeah, I did.
All the tough questions go to him. Well, good morning. So I'm here with two Dons, a Dan, and a Herb. So the odds are 60-40 I'm going to screw something up in the next 30 minutes. So we're going to talk about consumer trends, and obviously, like every panel, we've had a chance to have some conversations in advance of coming up here on stage. And we focused on a couple of things that are in some ways contradictory. So we're going to talk a little bit about that for the next 31 minutes and 49 seconds. And one of the things, I'm so glad that one of the things we kind of focused in our conversations was something that I think about a lot. And that is that in the food retail industry, there seems to be remarkably little focus on food. I think we spend a lot of time with good reason about talking technology and operations, but we don't talk enough about food. And yet in all my conversations individually with all of you, one of the things that you talked about was the notion that there's a growing emphasis on the diversity of flavor. And that is driving a lot of growth because that's emanating from the consumer. I thought there was a great example of that last night in the reception outside. I don't know if anybody had the empanadas that are made with agave and cream cheese, which is a combination I'd never had before, and it was delicious. And it was like, oh, wow, that's something different. So I guess my first question is, since you've all agreed that diversity of flavor is important, what do you think is driving this? Why are consumers more interested in flavor and perhaps more willing to try new foods than ever before? I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin. I think, I think when you specifically talk about beverage alcohol in this case, my world, flavor is lagging behind or has lagged behind versus where it's been with many of the other CPG categories. Certainly the influx of different consumer trends coming globally to this country, different cultures driving that impact has been a big part of it. But yeah, when you look at beverage alcohol specifically, it has had a really profound impact on beverage alcohol to the point that a fourth category has now emerged and separated from traditional beer, wine, and spirits. Which, if you think about how long beer, wine, and spirits have been around for centuries, it's remarkable. And this category, we call it flavor at Mark Anthony because that's the dominant attribute driving it. So it consists of hard seltzers, flavored malt beverages, ciders, and spirits ready to drink premixed cocktails. And when you look at other categories, this is the category within beverage alcohol that has driven the most sales and innovation sales and sales growth over the last 5 years. When you look across other categories, which we started to do about 7-8 years ago, we had noticed that these other categories, flavor was making anywhere from 50 to 90% of their sales. And I'm talking about things like ready-to-eat popcorn, tea, really tortilla chips, sparkling water, et cetera, yogurt. And we saw at the time that it only made up about 9% of beer's total sales. Now you fast forward and it's evolved to the point where it's more than doubled. It's about 20% of beer sales. It's about 14% of total alcohol. and everyone sees that this is where the consumer is going. And as a result, we've had a huge influx. I mean, 70% increase in the number of suppliers now in this category and the number of SKUs selling just over the last 5 years.
Same thing at Meijer?
Yeah, I would say we're seeing that trend, globally, not just in the alcohol category, but across the entire box, right? I think a lot of it's driven through a few different things. One, changing demographic trends, right? And I think a more willingness to explore. Part of that probably coming out of COVID. We spent 2 years at home. Everyone's learning to cook again and have different exploration. I think you see that continue to spill over. You're seeing the demographics change in the United States, right? So I think that allows people to explore different cultures, different foods, and really get excited. So I think as you look across all our different categories, flavor is really becoming a real dominant player in terms of how we innovate. So whether it's from working with CPG companies on their own products or even our own brand products, if you walk down the aisles, you're going to see flavor as a key dominant tenet in all the different products that we have out there. Spicy flavors, especially bold flavors, are really coming to the forefront. You think about what's gone on for the last several years with Hatch chili and the Ghost Reaper, right, pepper. All those different things you're seeing come to the forefront to be much more popular than they would have been years past. And I think the other piece of that really has to do with social media. So you've got a medium. It used to be years ago you'd have all these trends happen, maybe start in Europe or start in the coast, and they kind of trickle through to the middle of the United States. Now it happens instantaneously, right? People explore something, they share it, and across the globe, let alone across the United States, someone wants to try a new idea or a new flavor that they hadn't heard of before. So it's just expanding so quickly.
I mean, you have the big stores, but there's still this limited square footage, right? Are you finding that you're accessing more local purveyors, smaller companies, because they're being more adventurous than the big manufacturers? Or do you find the big manufacturers are being equally as adventurous in terms of trying new things?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit of both, right? I think absolutely, you always have the entrepreneurs, the smaller manufacturers who can come on, be really nimble and bring things to the market fairly quickly. But a lot of the large manufacturers, they see the trends, they see the same data. We just saw that presentation on data, right? And they're researching those trends and bringing them to the forefront. Like anything, large companies are going to be a little more risk averse, right, on how far they're going to push that flavor profile. Smaller companies tend to be a little more willing to kind of push those edges and find, where those boundaries are with the consumer. But you're seeing it both from large CPGs, small local players, and even as we procure and develop our own brands as well.
Herb, I would assume that at Gallo you're seeing the same sort of diversification in terms of flavor that they're seeing.
Yeah, we definitely are. Dan hit on it. This fourth category has really exploded for us. I've been with Gallo 35 years. I started selling Bartles and James back in 1989 for $2 a 4-pack. We're fortunate to have this brand.
Whatever happened to Bartles and James? And I recognize that about 75% of this audience is too young to even know who those guys are.
Well, there's some of us out there that know about Bartles and James. We actually tried to bring it back. It did. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. We were not successful, but this high noon phenomenon, it just ready to drink cocktails, is just exploding. Yeah. And it's a really interesting phenomenon. My point is, in 4 years, high noon got to what Bartles and James took 25 years to get to, in terms of volume, at 5 times the price, which is really interesting.
So, Don, you've had roles shaping both Mariano's and Dom's, which were both very food-forward companies. So I would imagine that you weren't just reacting to this sort of new emphasis on flavor, food exploration, new things, ethnic, whatever you want to call it. You were actually helping to shape it.
Absolutely. From the very beginning, we were looking for the point of differentiation. This started before COVID. What was happening? I think yesterday was mentioned about the apocalypse of brick and mortar. What's defensible? What's different? So we put flavor and global cuisine at the center of what Dom's is all about. It's a defensible position. It's also, as much as we love this industry, and I have 45 years in public service announcement, this is what you look like after 45 years in retail. But the defensible position that we took with Dom's, and I love the industry, but a lot of folks see shopping as a chore, right? It's not an enjoyable experience. So when you're able to change the box, make it experiential, bring those flavors, and also, if you want to compete, we've got to continue to grow our business, and people are finding these flavors off-premise in food service. So how do you bring that into your box as a point of differentiation and not completely compete on price, but give the customer something they enjoy and that's different?
And certainly in the Dom stores, even more than at the Mariano stores, you could go in there and you could see people congregating, creating community around food. You would see on a Saturday morning, a Sunday morning especially, that there was community being built, and that's one of the advantages that the consumer trend towards being food forward actually helps create.
Absolutely, and COVID was just a tailwind in terms of, again, mentioned yesterday, how we want to congregate and be social again. So we caught that tailwind at Dom's, and it's people enjoy spending the time, and time to learn,
Right.
time to learn and teach and engage. And we had folks playing chess, right? Sitting there playing chess, exploring the food, and it's really part of the community. And again, you talk about loyalty and loyalty programs, everything we can do for loyalty. You get into the community, connect with that customer, that's a retention mechanism.
You referred to something that's been said a number of times on this stage, and point of personal privilege here. There's been a lot of people who've talked about, some people talked about the apocalypse and the end of brick and mortar. And you're right, a lot of people have said that, but most of the people who said that were people who had a rooting interest in the death of brick and mortar. Mm-hmm. I think anybody with a half a brain understood that the only thing that was going to go away was crappy brick and mortar. So I just feel really strongly about that. Anyway, I'll move on. I get a little touchy about this stuff. A question I want to ask both of you who are in the alcohol business, because at the same time as we have people experimenting with new flavors, you have during January and now February, I don't know if it made it into March, people who were saying, I'm not going to have your product anymore. I'm not going to drink. The whole moderation and no alcohol trend has become really pronounced in the last couple of years. Maybe that's because we all drank too much during COVID. Another reaction. How have you sort of dealt with that in terms of A, wanting to continue to bring out new flavors, new products, but also recognizing that there's a growing percentage of the population that seems to be moving away from what we might think of as being traditional alcohol consumption?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a couple of things. I think you've got a combination of the U.S. population is definitely aging, and then you see this moderation trend in particular with Gen Z consumers, which is quite different from previous generations who preceded them. And so I think there's a couple of things I would say that really are important here. One is this is no longer the same non-alc occasion that it was years ago, where it was viewed more as a substitute for alcohol within the beverage alcohol situation. It's really now become just another part of the consumer's repertoire, another occasion within their repertoire. So needing to really understand that is important. The majority of consumers buying non-alcoholic products today are also buying alcohol, which is also quite different. So I think those are really important. I think understanding that this trend, like you alluded to, Kevin, is long-term, means that suppliers in our space need to really think about that and the ramifications, and how are we going to broaden our horizons to get our fair share of these occasions. So we launched White Claw 0% alcohol in January to get it out there in time for dry January. But what I would tell you is dry January is no longer as big of a deal, because we're seeing this occasion have massive spikes in the summer months as well. So it's now a year-long consumption pattern with this, and I think suppliers need to adapt.
Yeah, we're constantly looking at it, Kevin. You're seeing products that are lower in alcohol. What's interesting, no alcohol products, beer can really do it, because a non-alcoholic beer tastes like a beer. In spirits and wine, you can't replicate that taste. Alcohol brings, to your point about flavors, alcohol creates those flavors. So we're doing lower alcohol wine. We've always represented our products in a responsible manner. And we think, to what Dan was talking about, it's just part of, calorie management and moderation. And, in the 90s, the 60 Minutes segment about the French paradox and how the French, eat fatty foods and cheeses and also have a glass or two of wine, and they were living longer. That really skyrocketed the industry. We need something like that to come back, but we look at it. We look at it constantly.
Well, since my last name originally used to be pronounced Coupe, I'd like to say I'm sticking with the French paradox. When the doctor says, should you be drinking so much red wine, I keep saying, but the French say it's okay.
It's okay.
I don't understand. I'm curious from the retail perspective. I was fascinated by one of the things that Katie was talking about yesterday in terms of context, a word that just came up on stage as well. And that in so many ways, recipes seem to be like the ultimate context when it comes to trying to sell food. And it seems to me that by being aggressive in terms of recipe content, in terms of connecting products in the consumer's mind, you can actually grow sales and get people to try new flavors, because sometimes if you put this with this and then with that, something new comes out of it. Is that creating that context? Is that something that you guys are trying to do at Meijer?
Yeah, I think you see all retailers, right, have been trying to do this for many, many years, whether it's solutions in store in terms of pulling things together, recipes online, you see that continue to grow, which we have as well.
To be fair, Katie's point was, and I think she's right about this, a lot of retailers talk about it, a lot of retailers try it, but the subset of retailers that do it really well is much smaller.
Very hard. Yes, it is. It is not an easy thing to pull together, right? I mean, quite frankly, and I think, but the reality is digital and the whole digital medium has made it much more simple for us to bring those type of things and solutions together for the customer than, years past when it was just pure brick and mortar, right? You're trying to tell that whole story in the store. Well, now you have a lot of different mediums that you can share that story, bring together those different ideas for a consumer. Or if they're going online and shopping, how do you build their basket for them? Is there, hey, I want to have an Italian night. Well, help me build what that might look like. And there are different flavors you can recommend to them to bring to the forefront. And I do think that's made it much more simple than it has in years past.
Did you do the same thing at Dom's and Mariano's?
We did, and what probably one of the stepwise changes with Dom's was bringing the executive chef on board, who really is able to take that to the next level. So whether that's recipes, videos, in-store entertainment, really would help folks understand how to get to. We've not done it well in retail. You think about a salad bar, for example, Kevin, right? How many times you go to a salad bar and get the same thing all the time? I go on premise to a restaurant, I have a great salad. Teach me how to make a better salad than just getting chicken and cheese and cucumbers, whatever the case may be. So the consumers are warm for that idea, and I think there's ways to go yet.
I know this question doesn't really affect the alcohol manufacturers on stage, but I do want to ask the retailers. I expressed a certain amount of skepticism yesterday about the whole retail media network space, but it seems to me that is a place where, if it's done right, a retail media network could actually be affected. If I have a smart cart and there's a screen and I put 2 items into my cart, ideally, maybe we're not there yet, it should be able to say, oh, if you get these other 2 items, here's a recipe that you could use. It seems to me that's a place where retail media networks could be effective.
I would agree, and I think in some cases the technology and the electronic shelf tags as well, with the NFC chip that can interact with your phone. And I'm looking at one of Herb's wine. I want to understand who the vintner is, and I want to understand how to pair that, and it can trigger from the NFC chip in the ESL.
I think it ties a lot to what you shared yesterday about not having the friction between the consumer, right? So retail media networks, if you're building it still with the customer in mind, and ultimately serving up things that are not just self-serving, maybe whether to the retailer or to a different CPG in the organization, if it's really about the customer, you can absolutely leverage that, and it does add a lot of value. And I think that's going to be the key differentiator. When you look at all the retail media networks that are exploding across the industry right now, those are still keeping it customer-focused and customer-centric. I think long-term we're going to add that value.
Yeah. So if we're talking about being food forward, talking about new flavors, ethnic foods, new kinds of things that way, but the other trend that we all talked about in advance was the notion of people being a little bit more worried about money. And that's clearly something that's grown out of inflation, a recessionary mindset, even if we didn't actually have a recession. And So let me ask you a question. You're all in the business of trying to sell more product and to expose people to new things and get them to try it. So how do you then deal with the notion and build into your business plan the idea that people are having to be more careful about money, and quite frankly, products are more expensive?
Yeah, I think it's a multitude of ways. First and foremost, I mean, Meijer, we're a value retailer, right? So that plays right into our strength. We're a value retailer, but we are a very broad assortment retailer. So we're able to bring a whole host of different solutions to our customer, regardless of your income spectrum or what you might be looking for at that given time. I think what we're seeing from the customer right now is, yes, there has definitely been, you're hearing about the cooling off of inflation, but most customers, the increase in costs went up so quickly, they still remember, right, what those costs generally felt like just a year or so. So you're seeing a little bit of this, it still feels hesitant, and how do I make choices at the shelf based upon my budget? So you might still want, we're having this conversation at breakfast, right, with my friends here from Clorox around Hidden Valley Ranch. You might still want your ranch dressing, right, but how you're choosing, the size you're selecting based upon your budget, as they were showing, is very important, and we're seeing that play out in our stores as well. I might still want a given product, but I might choose an alternative on a given week, whether it's I have this much to spend, so I choose a smaller item, or I want to really leverage on the value, so I pick up more of a bulk size item. So we're seeing the customer obviously react in different ways and trade across, as well as trade into different products or brands based upon promotions and activity going on in the store, as we're still trying to deal with the inflation that they're feeling over the last couple of years.
Now, Mariano's sort of had a bifurcated approach. It seems to me, you correct me if you think I'm mischaracterizing it. You were not a value retailer necessarily on the perimeter, but you were a value retailer in the center store. And then at Dom's, I think it's fair to say that you were not positioning yourself as a value retailer. So how does a retailer like that deal with the issues like inflation, recessionary mindset, people who are more concerned about money?
Yeah, unlike Don, our customer's a little different demographic, right? So, but everybody has their level of price and value. So it's really looking at the data, Kevin, understand what is most important to those key customers and how do we price directly or indirectly to the customers. And also looking at the competitive set in a bifurcated model, as you mentioned, and different than Mariano's at Dom's. We're not a grocery store with food. We are really a hybrid. At Mariano's, we sort of tagged on food to the grocery store, right? So the ability to target properly and also look at the different competitive set. When you have to, you can be pretty myopic as a retailer and think about grocery, but in our business, we also had to look at the food service side of the equation and price appropriately. And then the challenge is on retailers in terms of finding those areas on the P&L where you can really work those numbers, work those lines, and offer value to the customer. But yesterday, I think we heard perception is value, and it's not all price necessarily, Kevin, and some of these things we talked about earlier in terms of how we help the customer, recipes, give you that degrees of pricing freedom.
I think what you mentioned too around personalization is key, right? So the ability to be able to provide personalized offers to customers,
right.
Really comes to the forefront as you look at an economy where people are a little less certain. And I think that does allow you to offer different customer segments the right item at the right time at the right price.
Well, and it's interesting because and I don't think you meant to do this, but sometimes people talk about value and price as if they're synonyms, and they're not.
They're not.
Right? Low price is not necessarily, does not necessarily relate to value. You can get a low price item that's pretty crappy, and you haven't gotten any value for your money. On the other hand, you could pay, you could pay a little bit more for something, and it has great value, and it might last longer. It might be more nutritious. So, and this is a question for all of you: is it critical for this industry to find ways to communicate the idea that value and price are not the same thing? Anybody?
Yeah, I think you look at our portfolio in particular, we play in what we call the super high end, so we're very premium. And, along with flavor, premiumization has been a big macro trend over the last 10, 15 years, driving a lot of this. And, in alcohol, I would say the inflation did not go quite as extensive as it did in some other categories. So we still have been able to see premiumization grow. It slowed a little bit in the last year, but we've tried to really make sure that we represent the quality of these premium brands, and there's various price tiers out there within the categories, of course, but we're always sensitive to it. We're monitoring it closely. But you've got to make sure that you stand behind the quality of your products in this case, and we've seen the super high end in beer in particular grow its share throughout the pandemic, and then when you add the inflation on afterwards, it's really led to a lot of in-home entertainment increasing, so that's kind of played a part as well. So every category is going to be different. Alcohol tends to be a little more recession resistant historically, so we're in a bit of a unique position there.
Well, the good thing is when we're miserable, we want to drink more. That's my observation. I don't know what that means. Value, price. How do you separate?
Yeah, I think, customers are savvy, right? So even if you look at our customers who might be SNAP customers, and you look at the choices they make, I think people tend to assume, oh, well, they're going to choose just the lowest price item. That's not the case when you look at the data, right? So they are looking for, regardless of your spectrum, what is the best value for my dollar? And I think being respectful of that and understanding how you communicate that is critical. And quality is, paramount, right, in everything you do. Because you can give something really cheap, right? But if it does not deliver on the flavor profile, if it does not deliver on the quality over time, they will not choose it again. I think being thoughtful about how you serve up because customers are smart, and being respectful of the fact that they're smarter than you think they are, and really give them that credit because you can see it play out.
I mean, it makes me crazy when you see stories about people who say, I'm going to McDonald's and I'm having a value meal because it's a value, and I can get more for my money at McDonald's than I can going to the supermarket. And it's like, that's just not true. Because whatever you get, it's done, whatever you spend. But if you go to the supermarket, you actually might be able to get a product and get 2-3 meals out of it. It's going to be more nutritious. There is greater value of it. And I think, in some ways, I think this industry has done a lousy job of communicating that to consumers. That just because it's called a value meal doesn't mean it's a really good value.
No, I would agree. I think it's, all those elements of what goes into value, Kevin. Like Don is saying, and you're mentioning, I can get really cheap produce, but it doesn't last, right? I can go in the store and nobody greets me. There's value to that interaction, right? So I think the elements of value and how you build it up gives you the opportunity to understand how much you can price differentiate. And I think everybody has different triggers on value, and I think the problem that retailers typically do is go right to that price. I think your point is well taken in terms of communicating those other value elements.
At Gallo, how do you sort of draw that line?
Yeah, I mean, obviously value and price is really important. Consistency of your product is important. One of the big themes we saw out of COVID was a K-shaped economy. We really talked to our customers about a balanced approach. And at whatever price point, you have to deliver. You have to over-deliver on, if you're buying a $5 bottle of wine, it needs to taste like 10. If you buy a $10, it needs to taste like 20. So we really challenge our winemakers and our processes to create products that deliver on that kind of context.
And I think the other piece, which you touched on, Don, for retailers, value is about the total experience, right? And I do think the move where the fear was brick and mortar is going to go away, it's all going to be, that's very transactional. I don't know how you all feel, but I don't have an emotional relationship with Amazon, right? Because it's so transactional. But when you have a brick and mortar retailer, when you have people involved, it creates community. And I think for retailers, for us, we look at it and say, how do we create those touch points that add value beyond simply the price of the item? How do you make the shopping experience pleasant? How do you greet customers when they come in the store? How do you think about what's going on in their lives beyond just that moment in time that they're shopping through your store, and help them? All of those touch points create value to a consumer and create loyalty, which hopefully cause that boomerang effect, which we heard about yesterday.
Yeah, and I would say, Don, I think is picking those spots where you create that value, right? We all know we can outsource, and we've done it in the past, you can outsource your sushi to a third party, or you can be using that same sashimi tuna or salmon that's in the seafood department and making your sushi in the store. cost more, right? But that there's value in that because it's fresh, it's differentiated. And I go, and cutting fruit, right? You can outsource, or you cut your fruit in store and you have the freshest fruit right out of the produce department. And there's no good or bad there. It's just what do you choose to hang your hat on that creates that incremental value for the customer and takes a little pressure off the price element.
I don't know that I would agree that there's no, I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. There's no good or bad in terms of, in an absolute sense. But there is better. And I think that when retailers are cutting fruit themselves, especially if you see them cutting fruit, you are communicating something about your business that differentiates you from the people who are just bringing in cut fruit from the outside or using a packaged sushi or something like that.
Yeah, and I think the halo effect that creates for the store as well is something that can't be undervalued, right? So I see all that, but there's a freshness connotation that goes around the store.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what you also said about people don't have an emotional connection to Amazon. I do.
Shame on you.
Though based on what I told you yesterday, we may need therapy. But I think people sometimes have more of an emotional connection to Amazon than they do with retailers that don't do a good job.
Fair.
Right? I mean, I think retailers that do a good job, you make an emotional connection. If I go to a Meijer, I go to a Dom's, I'm going to connect to that in a different kind of way. But if I go into, I'm not going to name them because I'll get shot. But there are certain stores I go into where not the only emotional connection I have is disgust, and that's a little harsh. But I may not make 23 years in Morning News Beat. But I think it depends on the retailer, and quite frankly, it depends on the brand, right? There are brands that do a good job of creating an emotional connection, and there are brands that do a lousy job. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to ask you real quickly, speculate. We're talking about consumer trends that are going right now, food forward, concerns about money, but if you had to look, and I always worry about saying 5 years out, but just in the next couple of years, if you had to think about a consumer trend or a consumer need that is not being addressed right now, that gap that I think Katie talked about yesterday, what do you think that is that the industry needs to focus on more, whether it's from the retailer or the manufacturer side? Don, why don't you start?
Yeah, I would say this continuing to really address what we've talked about in creating meals and solutions for consumers because they get bored. They're looking for opportunities. They're watching. How do we take that to the next level? I think we've scratched the surface, but there's so much there that can be done to help our consumers through creating different meals and ideas for what's on. I mean, what I put on for dinner tonight, we've been talking about it for 45 years, and we have not really solved it. I think this opportunity is there to continue to improve.
Yeah, and I would tie on what Don just said. The wine business has not been healthy the last few years, been softer. People are doing the ready to drinks. To Dan's point, people are going to spirits. The meal solution is critical. What Katie talked about yesterday, I talked to her last night at the reception. I think there's a real opportunity to build a watch there and enhance a meal and an affordable luxury at home and make a meal a little bit better with a bottle of wine. But we need to demystify the category. Yeah. And we have not done a good job as an industry with that. And the newer generation, many in this audience, don't drink wine. And there's a problem with that. We need to figure that out.
You have a very personal problem with
that. There's a problem with that. We need to figure that out.
Well, I do, and I listen, there's certain states you can't do it, but I do think retailers do it. Retailers that are able to cross-merchandise wine with food have a much better opportunity to kind of create that connection than retailers that are not allowed to do that.
Correct.
Right.
I agree with both what these gentlemen said, but I take a little different spin. I think, the conversation around health and wellness, you've heard food as medicine as, kind of a buzzword out there in the industry going on. I don't think anyone's fully unlocked it. I think if you look at the trends happening in the alcohol category, how people are viewing how they want to manage their own body, their own health, and really understanding that what you put in your body has, just a big impact, if not bigger than that when you have to go to the doctor and all the different traditional medical treatments. So I do think health and wellness is a core trend, and how we react and respond to that and get in the forefront is going to be one of those gaps that we need to be mindful of going forward.
And there was a story just the other day, I know we had on Morning News Beat about, there's like 14 studies going on around the country at various clinics to figure out how to make food more prescriptive, figure out what your health issues are, and based on a lot of different things, and then being able to say, no, you need to follow, if you want to live longer, you need to eat the following, have the following diet.
And drink red wine.
And drink red wine.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate that.
Because the French got it figured out.
No,
Bring us home.
just following up on what Don said, health and wellness obviously going to continue. Moderation, we talked about being a long-term trend. In alcohol, I think it's going to require suppliers to rethink beverage occasions as a whole. And I think what you're going to see, and we've seen it already, with non-alc companies dipping their toe into alcohol, whether it's Simply Spiked or Topo Chico or Monster or Mountain Dew, I think beverage alcohol suppliers are going to need to look at flipping the script and starting to think about how do we compete for those better for you occasions and those non-alc occasions outside of alcohol, whether it's sports drinks, energy drinks, CSDs, teas, you name it. I think there's going to be a new thought process over the next 5 years that hits beverage alcohol suppliers and says we've got to reinvent ourselves to a degree here.
Does that take the form of both R&D internally as well as the potential for acquisition?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Folks, give these guys a round of applause. Thank you. You were terrific.